Welcome back to Franklin Covey's weekly podcast on leadership with Scott Miller. That's me. I'm your host and interviewer every week, actually twice weekly. We now release episodes both in audio and video format, where on Tuesdays and Fridays, we shine our spotlight on some of the world's most, we think, important thought leaders. Sometimes they're entrepreneurs, other times they're academics, researchers, authors, thought leaders, creators, artists, celebrities, broad venue of intellect and insight. Sometimes it's people that have suffered unspeakable tragedies and have lived to share about it and teach through it. Rarely, however, in 6 years and 400 episodes have we had a guest return at our invitation for their third appearance. I think there maybe are 3 people in the Three Timers Club. And today we have gratefully invited back, and he's accepted to return. His name is David Rubenstein. He is, as you know, one of the nation's early private equity geniuses. He has built a fortune and shared it insanely generously with our nation. I'm going to ask him to talk about that. His book today, the third book that we have highlighted, is called The Highest Calling, and it releases today, Conversations on the American Presidency. Now, David has done something that very few people can pull off, and that is he creates these compilation books where he's interviewed people either on his television program or podcast or radio, or in cases like this, interviews with people that have had firsthand seats at either writing biographies or working in the White House or serving presidents in very close proximity, including David himself. He'll talk about. Looking forward to this conversation. David, welcome back to On Leadership.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to be here.
David, the pleasure is ours, sir. I've been a big fan of yours for decades. I have followed not just your professional career, but the wealth that you have built, and like I said, perhaps more importantly, the wealth that you have shared. At my invitation, I'm going to ask you, would you remind our listeners and viewers some of the ways in which you and your family have philanthropically invested in many of America's most important institutions, culturally, in the arts and literature, physically in some buildings? I just want people to understand that there is greatness on today's podcast because the wealth that you have built, you have plowed insanely generously back into our country. Would you just take that wherever you'd like to go?
Sure. I live in Washington, D.C. I worked in the White House for President Carter. And after that period of time, I stayed the remaining period of time up to the present in Washington. So I've tried to give back to Washington. But when you give back to Washington, you're giving back to the country in many ways. So I've been the chairman of the Kennedy Center, the Performing Arts Center in Washington. I've been their largest donor and I've been their chair for 14 years. I'm currently the chair of the National Gallery of Art. I'm also the chair of the Library of Congress Board. I'm also the chair of, I was the chair of the Smithsonian Institution, which is a great museum complex in Washington. I've been one of the largest donors to the Smithsonian, Library of Congress, National Gallery of Art. And I've also, in Washington, I've been the head of the Washington Economic Club, the Economic Club of Washington. So I've spent a lot of time trying to give back in Washington. And to do this, one of the things I've done is buy historic documents. So I bought the only copy in private hands of the Magna Carta and put it on permanent loan to the National Archives. I've also bought many rare copies of the Declaration of Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Bill of Rights, and similar kind of documents, and put them on loan to organizations in Washington, but around the country as well. I've also tried to fix up monuments that I thought it needed to be repaired a bit. And among those are the Washington Monument, Jefferson Memorial, Lincoln Memorial, Mount Vernon, Monticello, Montpelier, which was James Madison's home, the Iwo Jima Memorial, the Custis Lee Mansion at Arlington Cemetery, among other things, and tried to give back in ways that other people hopefully will emulate. One of the more enjoyable ones is something that I'll be announcing again soon, is I will be the new sponsor for our continuation of the sponsorship I've already done to bring the pandas back to Washington, D.C. Pandas are among the most popular animals in our National Zoo, which is part of the Smithsonian, and we have to pay the Chinese every year a certain amount of money for them, and I'll be announcing soon that I'm going to continue what I've been doing for the last 10 years in supporting that. So those are some of the things that I've tried to do to give back to our country, and I've called it patriotic philanthropy.
Contrary to the trolls on YouTube, I'm no sycophant, but I really think you are an American hero, sir. I especially am fond of your role in the Washington Monument. You glazed over it, but something happened that was sort of Mother Nature. And I'd like you just to take a minute more, we'll get into the books, where you talk about specifically what happened to the Washington Monument, one of the most iconic architectural presence in our nation, and what your role was in helping bring that back.
Well, in I think 2011, the Washington D.C. had an earthquake, which is something people in Washington didn't think could happen, and it cracked some buildings. Among those, it cracked was the Washington Monument. So this incredible monument to George Washington that didn't really open until almost 100 years after he died, had some severe cracks in it. I called the head of the National Park Service, which oversees the monument, and asked him if I could help get it fixed and get it done soon, because he had told me earlier that getting money out of Congress might be time consuming. So I put up the money that was necessary to fix the monument, and I've stayed involved with it and fixing the elevators and other things. So that monument can be visited by people from all over the world now without any problems.
David, how do you pick your projects? Do you have a committee? Is it usually personal passion? How do you tend to pick where you choose to put your money for the best good you see?
Well, I don't have a foundation or I don't have a staff. I try to do it all myself. Maybe that's a good idea. Maybe it's a bad idea, but at least I can blame myself if I don't like the way things work out, and I don't have to blame anybody else. I just blame myself. What I try to do is I have 4 principles. 1, I want to start something that otherwise wouldn't get started. 2, I want to finish something otherwise wouldn't get finished. 3, I want to have an intellectual interest in it so that I'll stay involved, not just write a check. And 4, I'd like to see progress in my lifetime. So there are many great causes in the world, and I've tried to support many things other than things I've just mentioned. But I generally like to see some progress in my lifetime. Some causes, I'm not sure I'm going to see progress in my lifetime. I have given a lot of money away to medical research and things like that in areas like pancreatic cancer or ALS. But generally, I recognize that they're going to be very, very slow in having progress. But I do think there is some progress in those 2 instances, for example. I'm also a big believer in scholarships. I had scholarships to go to college and to go to law school, and I've been very involved in the institutions that gave those to me. I got a scholarship to go to Duke University, and I became the chairman of the board of Duke. I think became their largest donor at the time that I was the chairman of the board. I'm now the chairman of the board of the University of Chicago, where I went to law school and given them a fair amount of money for scholarships and other kinds of things. So I like to give money in the scholarships because I think that really enables younger people to get educated and kind of do things that give back to society.
I don't know if our listeners and viewers caught that, but I heard the chair about a dozen times. And so I think it's worth repeating. I appreciate your selfless contribution to our nation. Sir, your newest book is called The Highest Calling, Conversations on the American Presidency. As I mentioned in my opening, you've written 2 other compilation books on leadership and business and such, and this one really is a highlight on about 25 or so presidents across the broad stretch of our nation's 45 plus, I think 45 presidents. Talk a little bit about why you chose this topic, and then I'm going to pick out 4 or 5 presidents and ask you to opine a little bit on.
Well, as a young boy, I watched John Kennedy's inaugural speech, which I think was one of the greatest inaugural speeches ever given. And I was inspired to want to work in the White House myself, not as an elected official. I didn't think I had the charm, good looks, money, or whatever it would take to get elected. But I thought that I could be an advisor, and I did work in the White House as a young man for President Carter. And ever since then, I've retained my interest in the presidency. So I thought that, if I wanted to explain certain things to people about something that was important to me, the presidency, I would do it in a way by interviewing scholars about great presidents or interviewing some presidents themselves. Now, your podcast is based around the theme of leadership. And where is there more leadership needed and where is more leadership required than the presidency, the ultimate leadership position, you could argue, in the Western world. So I've really been a student of the presidency for some years, and I just have a fascination that I hope other people will, if they don't become as fascinated as I am, they will do one thing that I try to urge people to do in the book, which is to learn about the presidential candidates and vote. We only have about 2/3 of Americans who are eligible to vote voting in every presidential election, which means that an enormous number of Americans who could vote choose not to vote. And obviously, a lot of people complain about their presidents from time to time, but there should be less complaining, or there would be, presumably, if more and more people actually voted and exercised their franchise. Over the 250 years of our country's history, we've had many millions of people die to fight for the right to vote, and it's unfortunate that many people don't exercise it.
David, I've had the privilege, the discipline, you might say, of reading all of your books, of watching many of the episodes on your various media platforms. I've also seen you speak at the World Business Forum in Manhattan, and you've had a front row seat to the American presidency. No doubt you've counseled with, worked in the Carter White House. You actually, after his presidency, your firm actually consulted with and hired former President George H.W. Bush, a man for which I actually worked for in Florida back in 1988, and ended up working in the Carlyle Group. From all of the presidents that you've either interviewed, you've met, you've socialized with, you've spent countless hours in meetings consulting on planes with, would you just remind us, maybe educate us on what do you think are the top competencies? Put maybe social policy aside, put your personal political views aside, for all of us. What do you think are the top competencies that people ought to have in their mind as they're formulating not just who they're going to vote for, but who they're going to support, talk about, evangelize, trash talk, you name it? What do you want people to remember?
Well, I think people need to make sure that the person they're voting for and the candidate that does become president is a person who has reasonably good intelligence. You don't have to be Albert Einstein, but reasonably good intelligence, a very good work ethic, ability to share the credit with other people, that has a vision of where they want to take the country and what they want to do to make the country a better place. And all presidents have these qualities at lesser or greater degrees. Of the presidents I've known, and I've known many of them since President Carter, there clearly have been some that are extraordinarily talented in certain areas. Some are very persistent in other areas. Some are very good at conceptual kind of ideas. Some are very good at details. But you really want somebody that has a real commitment to the country and wants to make the country a better place. And that's what you're really looking for in a president.
David, across the 40 plus presidents we've had, I think we're coming on 45-ish or so, who do you think has received the least credit? Like their legacy really has never been told or enshrined. Is there a president that you think their story hasn't been told in a reasonably fair light?
Well, of course, the best example of this in recent decades was Harry Truman. Harry Truman left office with a very, very low approval rating, and many people thought he didn't live up to the standards of FDR. And he was seen as an uneducated person. He never went to college. He was seen as somebody that didn't have great vision. But despite all that, it's now on reflection, people think that he actually did some incredible things. For example, he had the courage and ability to go forward with the atomic bombs that ended World War II. You can debate whether they were good or not to do that, but he did do it, and I think that was a courageous decision. But he also helped create NATO. He helped create the CIA. He helped create the UN. He helped create many organizations like the World Bank and the IMF that still are very important to our society. And he did so without any suggestions of impropriety. He was not a person who was caught with any kind of corruption or anything like that. And he did it in a very plain-spoken way. Now, a few years ago, when he was not that popular, a book came out that was written by David McCullough called Truman. It won the Pulitzer Prize, and it began the effort to get people to know much more about Harry Truman that had been known and look at him in a more favorable light. My own former boss, Jimmy Carter, was derided for having lost to Ronald Reagan in a landslide, and he was thought to be not that competent, not that much of a visionary. But as you suggested earlier, in the 40 years that he's left the presidency, President Carter, who's still alive now at 99, has done incredible things to add to society beyond what he did as president. But his presidency had some bad luck, but he did do some things that I think were pretty incredible as president, but that's overshadowed probably by what he did since he left the presidency.
David, again, politics aside if possible, one of my most incredulous experiences is when daily on Facebook or Instagram or whatever it is, you'll see, I think, well-intended citizens that are usually pro-Trump, and no comment on that's good or bad, but they'll usually talk about, here are the gas prices under this presidency, gas prices under this presidency, eggs, interest rates, fruit, milk. How much impact does the office of the presidency have on the price of milk, egg, cheese, interest rates, monetary policy? Tell us if you think that's realistic for people to hold a single woman or man responsible for the price of gas at the pump.
Well, the price of oil is really set by an international cartel called OPEC, and our ability to impact it is reduced. We are now the largest producer in the world on a daily basis of oil. We produce more oil every day than Saudi Arabia. But overall, the OPEC nations produce much more than we do. So the President of the United States has some impact on the oil prices of oil, but not that much, or the price of gasoline. For example, we do have a strategic petroleum reserve. We can use that to reduce prices a bit. But in the end, there are global events that are going to be more important than anything a president can do. With respect to price of food, clearly many of the things there depend on weather, whether crops can grow or not, or whether there are famines in certain parts of the world. So that's a lot beyond what a president can do. Now, a president can have an impact on economic policy, of course, but on something you just suggested, he does not typically make interest rate decisions. Those are made by the Federal Reserve. And while the president can do certain things in fiscal policy with legislation that might increase spending and might decrease spending, the president doesn't really affect interest rates as much as many people might think. There's no doubt, though, that if a president of the United States is exercising his leadership capabilities, or maybe soon her leadership capabilities, that can have a big effect on the economy, prices, and everything else, the way we live in our society. But people often overstate what a president can really do.
David, it's ironic that you picked Harry Truman to talk about, whose story hasn't been told. He was the first president I was actually going to highlight today, because I don't know that most people in America under the age of 50 remember that it was Truman who actually made the decision to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Would you maybe just recount what you learned about that decision, about his conscience, about what he thought the aftermath might be? Maybe give us a recap of history there.
Okay, it was Albert Einstein who was importuned by some friends of his to write a letter to FDR saying that the Germans were working on something that might lead to, in effect, an atomic bomb, which would be a weapon that we had no defense against, and we ought to do something about that. And so that led ultimately to the Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb. Harry Truman was not informed of it, and he didn't learn about it until after FDR died in April of 1945. When he was later told about it, he was briefed thoroughly on it. At one time, right as he was leaving Potsdam for more or less a post-war conference with our allies, he was told the bombs are ready to be dropped, and he authorized 2 bombs to be dropped, one in Hiroshima and one in Nagasaki. Now, they were devastating. They killed hundreds of thousands and maimed hundreds of thousands of people. The argument for doing so was that if we had to invade Japan at that time, we would lose hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Japanese would be killed. So the argument was this would shorten the war, and people have debated whether that was right or not ever since then. But it was a very courageous thing to do, because he recognized that by saying go ahead with these atomic bombs, he was going to be killing, I'd say, scores and scores of thousands of people in Japan. But there was no way around ending the war short of that. At least that's what he thought. He was not somebody that ever had second thoughts about it. He never said, I shouldn't have done that. He always thought he made the right decision, and I think history generally thinks that he made the right decision.
David, slightly off topic, but I'm interested in your opinion. In your judgment, was the attack on Pearl Harbor unknown to the U.S. government? Or some might suggest, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, that actually it was known and allowed to happen so that we could retaliate and hopefully end the war?
That's a theory that has been around for some time, and I don't think there's any evidence of it. It was well known that the Japanese were going to attack some facilities in the Pacific. We picked up intelligence to that effect. We didn't know exactly where they were going to attack, and we didn't know exactly the nature of the attack or when it would occur. But we did have intelligence that indicated that Japan was planning some type of surprise attack, but we just didn't know when or where. So I think it's unfair to say that President Roosevelt, as some have said, knew there was going to be an attack on Pearl Harbor, and he wanted that attack to occur so that he could then get Congress to go into the war. Because before that, the United States had resisted going into World War II. But I think it's unfair to say that the U.S. actually knew that Pearl Harbor was going to occur at the time that it did.
Let's move to Richard Nixon. I think most views of him are quite demonic, quite uncharitable, especially with the younger generation that perhaps only is taught about Watergate and not about some of the other things that Richard Nixon did that were remarkable, including, our breakthrough with China. What's something positive, consequential you'd like the world to know about Richard Nixon's presidency?
Well, you just suggested probably the most historic thing that Richard Nixon did was to reopen or open relations with China. China had been walled off from the Western world ever since 1949, and as a result, we had no contact, and you had a gigantic country, the largest population in the world, living largely in poverty and unconnected to the rest of the world. By opening China, which took many years to actually have the real benefits of that to occur, I think Nixon did something that was quite historic. Among other things that he did that people don't really remember is he was really an environmental president. Many of the most important environmental pieces of legislation that have existed in this country occurred under President Nixon. For example, the EPA was created then. The Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act occurred during Nixon's presidency, not because he was a big environmentalist, but he thought this was a way to kind of thwart what the Democrats were going to try to do against him, arguing that he wasn't a good environmentalist. He also was very good in kind of opening up the relations again with Russia. It was considered to be unusual for a president of the United States to meet with the head of Russia. That had happened before. Eisenhower had done it and Kennedy had done it, but he began a process of really re-engaging with the Russians in ways that I think helped ultimately end the Cold War.
David, pause when you think about this for a moment. What word comes to mind when you think of President Bill Clinton?
Bill Clinton has one of the most electric minds I've ever met of anybody, president or non-president. He had the ability and has the ability to connect the dots quite well, and he's extremely smart and really is focused on public policy. And as I say in the book, he had what I would really call as a beautiful mind when it comes to public policy. He obviously had some flaws that hurt him and led to an impeachment. But I think what he did as president really was quite remarkable in many ways. He was reelected. And one of the signs of success of a presidency is often thought to be whether you're reelected. Now, of course, presidents in their second term often have problems. But I think Bill Clinton did many good things, including taking the country to a position where it actually balanced the budget and had modest surpluses for 3 of the last 4 years of his presidency. It's hard to believe it, but we actually had surpluses in our budget for 3 of his four last years as president, where we haven't had a budget surplus or a budget balance ever since then.
David, it's not so uncommon, especially as of late, for a vice president to ascend, hopefully, ethically, to the presidency. Gerald Ford and Joseph Biden and others like that, George H.W. Bush. It's interesting how sometimes those are really sort of like arranged marriages, right? I mean, look at the story between Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. I mean, these were not people of the same political ideology. As you point out, George H.W. Bush had to change his position on abortion in order to receive the invitation to become vice president. There's often frosty relationships. I don't know that George H.W. Bush even really knew Dan Quayle prior to that. Why is that relationship so frosty, generally speaking? Is it not so much? Is it closer than we think it is generally? What have you learned about the importance or lack of importance on that intimacy, if you will?
Well, the vice presidency was dreamed up by our founding fathers, but they never really gave very much responsibility to the vice presidents other than to preside over the Senate and therefore break tie votes. It was seen as such an insignificant job that John Adams, when he was the first vice president, mostly lived in Boston or in Quincy, Massachusetts. There was really nothing for him to do. And so he didn't think it was very a worthwhile job. One vice president, John Nance Gardner, once said it wasn't worth a warm pitcher of spit, which would mean he had 8 years as vice president under FDR, and he really had no responsibilities to speak of. And interestingly, when Teddy Roosevelt was vice president under McKinley, he thought of going to Columbia Law School while he was vice president because he had so little responsibilities that he thought he could live in New York and go to law school. It shows you that times have changed a bit. Vice presidents, beginning with, I think, Vice President Mondale under President Carter, got more and more responsibilities. Vice presidents, though, do tend to get things like going to funerals and other kinds of responsibilities that presidents don't often want. The relationships sometimes are very close, but sometimes they're not very close. In the case of that you cited, Ronald Reagan really did not want George Herbert Walker Bush as his vice president, and George Herbert Walker Bush didn't expect to be selected. But Gerald Ford was flirting with it, and it was an idea that Gerald Ford would be vice president under Ronald Reagan, the idea being that Reagan didn't have enough experience, Ford had it, but in the end that didn't work out. Reagan then thought about his best friend, one of his best friends, Paul Laxalt, but that was thought to be two Westerners and didn't think it was a balanced ticket. So in the end, Reagan did ask George Herbert Walker Bush, And that led to his becoming president, because he had not served for vice president for 8 years, almost certainly wouldn't have not have been elected president in 1988.
David, from your near encyclopedic knowledge and research and discipline on learning about these presidents, is there one, if you could magically have dinner for 2 hours with one of the past, is there one person that says, oh, I would love to go to dinner with this one?
Sure. And I should point out that I did say in the book that I'd love to have interviewed some of these presidents myself, but many times there were no interviews. I should say I'd like to have read interviews. There are no interviews of presidents much before the last 20 or 30 years, because the interview format did not exist. There are no interviews with George Washington. There are no interviews with Abraham Lincoln, and so forth. But the president that I would most like to have dinner with, without doubt, is Abraham Lincoln. He was, in my view, the greatest president. He saved the country, because at that time, the South was moving away, seceding from the North. Many people in the North said, "Let him go, let him go. We don't want a country that has slavery anyway." And I think Lincoln preserved the country and also ended slavery. So he would be also a person of incredible humility, incredible intelligence. He never went to school, but he gave and wrote the greatest speeches our country's ever seen: the Gettysburg Address, the Second Inaugural Address, among others. So he would be by far the most important person I would want to have dinner with or spend time with, of any of our people who have been president.
What talent or value or character trait did he possess that you hope for in our next president?
I hope our next president is somebody that is focused on not what is best for him or her, but what is best for the country, and that puts everything he or she has into it, all the energy, all the time, and basically learns how to motivate people and excite people to want to participate in government, and learn how to break down the divide we have in Washington. That's probably one of the most important things any president can do, is try to bring the country back together again. We're not in the Civil War mode, for sure, but the divide between the red and the blue in Washington, D.C. and the country is fairly considerable. And a president that can help to breach that, I think, would be doing great service to our country.
Do you have expectations that either of the main party nominees can do that? Without naming a name, are you hopeful that one of the two of those, who will likely become president unless some tragedy happens, hopefully not, are you hopeful?
Hope springs eternal, and I'm hopeful that whoever becomes president of the United States will recognize that the most important thing to do is to make this country stronger than it is, and the best way to do that is to bring the country together. I don't have the ability to do that. A president can. I do try to bring members of Congress together, and once a month for the last 10 years, I've hosted a dinner on Capitol Hill at the Library of Congress for members of Congress, where I ask them to come have dinner. I interview a historic writer on American history, and then have them have dinner, and I ask them to sit with people from the opposite party and the opposite house to get to know each other better, so that we can maybe bring together the kind of divide we have in Washington. It hasn't had as much impact as I would like, but members of Congress seem to like it, and we get about 250 members of Congress coming every time we have a dinner.
David, one of my personal heroes is actually not a president, but plays a prominent backstage role, kind of a through line through some of the last presidents, and that's, of course, former Secretary of State James Baker, also Secretary of Treasury, and has had numerous roles in the Reagan and Bush White Houses and such, a friend of yours, obviously. I don't know that much of the nation now even knows who James Baker is. I'm a huge fan of his. What would you say about James Baker?
Jim Baker was the best friend of George Herbert Walker Bush. He managed his campaign for president in 1980, which didn't get anywhere. But later he helped to organize the debates that Ronald Reagan had with Jimmy Carter. He later became Reagan's first chief of staff, later Reagan's Secretary of Treasury, and then later George Herbert Walker Bush's Secretary of State. And I think he's one of the most impressive public servants I've ever seen or known. He was in my firm for about 15 years. He's now 94 and a half years old, but still doing interviews and still, I think, okay. He's had some health issues, but at 94 and a half years old, I guess everybody has some health issues. But incredibly talented person who knew how to get things done and knew how to get people to work together. So he's one of the most impressive people post-World War II that I've seen serve in the federal government.
I hope to check my politics on this podcast. One of my favorite photographs of all time was when former President George H.W. Bush was at the end of his life. There was a photograph of James Baker at the foot of his bed holding President Bush's foot in a sock. And I just thought it was very endearing I don't know if you saw that photograph, but I get emotional thinking
Yes.
about it.
Yes, they were very close friends, and that was one of the reasons why George Herbert Walker Bush had such a successful foreign policy. He had a Secretary of State who was his closest friend, and there was no divide between them. And the incident you're talking about, toward the very end of George Herbert Walker Bush's life, Jim Baker was there and rubbing his foot, and he said to President Bush said, "Where are we going, Jim? Where are we going?" And he said, "To heaven. We're all going to heaven."
David, what's next for you, sir? What's next on the horizon? When you come back on this podcast, hopefully for a fourth time, what topic will you be talking about?
I'm not sure yet. I recently became an owner of the Baltimore Orioles, and I've thought about writing a book on sports ownership and what it means to be an owner of a sports team and interview some owners about it, but I'll see if I can get that done.
David, what will be your legacy? You've got a couple decades left for sure of business, philanthropy, friendships, impact. If today was your last day and your obit was aired tomorrow on tomorrow morning's NBC Today show, they announced that the great David Rubenstein had passed. What do you hope is the lead line?
Well, I just hope that people would say that I gave back to the country and I did as best as a citizen can do on the outside to try to give back to the country, and left 3 children who hopefully will carry on my legacy, and through scholarships and other money that I left behind will have impact on society long after I'm gone.
David, I think you are the essence of leadership. You are a New York Times bestselling author, philanthropist, father, friend, entrepreneur. The highest calling, conversations on the American presidency. If anybody wants their children, their nephews, their grandchildren to have a better appreciation for the history of our country, the intimacy that happens within the White House and legislative policy, what a great compilation book. Sir, honored that you gave us another 30 minutes this year. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
And we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.